welcome once again. My name's Tanya Beckett. I'm a news and current affairs presenter for the BBC. And I think my job now is to divert the agenda a little bit into business solutions. We have three esteemed panelists here who are going to talk us through some real live solutions to problems concerning sustainability that they are exacting in their field of work. So let me first of all introduce them. Vijay Swarup is the Chief Climate Scientist for ExxonMobil Corporation. Welcome to you. Pedro Lerner is the CEO of Grupo UNACEM, and he is really in the world of cement and concrete, which you don't need me to tell you is extremely important for growing economies, and of course has plenty of challenges. And also I'd like to introduce to you from the World Bank Anna Bjerde, who is the Managing Director of Operations. Welcome to all of you. I'm going to start, if I can, with UNACEM in the middle here and Pedro. Concrete and cement are very, very important, but I'd like you to describe just how important and how big an operation it is, because you are a world leader in this market. It's a very energy-intensive business, so you've had a lot of problems to solve, but you've made a great deal of progress in solving them. We'll come to the solutions a little bit later, but first, if you would, a little bit about your business.
Thank you, Tanya, for your kind words. It's a privilege for me to be here and represent Grupo UNACEM. And as a Peruvian, I'm honored to welcome the APEC CEO Summit back to Peru. Grupo UNACEM is a Peruvian corporation with more than 100 years of experience focused in the cement, concrete, and electric power generation business. We operate in 5 countries, 5 Pacific-facing economies, 3 of which are members of APEC, which are the United States, Peru, and Chile. And as you said, the cement and concrete industries are absolutely essential for development. They're at the backbone of reliable and sustainable, resilient infrastructure and urbanization. They're essential to build bridges, dams, schools, hospitals, and highways. But it is true, the cement manufacturing is a very carbon-intensive activity. It's one of what they call the hard-abating industries in the world. And that's a major challenge for the industry. But, and the thing is that we think that for the solution, I mean, we have to face a carbon neutrality. The global industry, cement and concrete industry, is aware of its responsibility with regards of climate change mitigation and adaptation, and it's taking responsibility for its CO2 emissions and committed to carbon neutrality or net zero by the year 2050. The thing is that we believe that solutions will have to come from within the industry, and I think that each region and it will also have to be tailored to each region, to reality of each region. In this regard, I would like to focus on Latin America in particular and the challenges that it entails. Only a few weeks ago, the COP16 on biodiversity focused on the accelerated deterioration of biodiversity, of ecosystems in particular, that are essential for regulating the environment and, of course, underpin the success of our economies and financial markets. And the thing is that the rise in temperature beyond 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, we think that will have a negative impact on economic growth, especially in low-income countries like we have. We think that it's pretty much related to nature loss. We think that just to give you an example of the importance of nature and how it relates to this problem, in 2013, the wildfires in Canada released more carbon to the atmosphere than the economic activities of 190 of the 183 United Nations member states. And in Latin America, more than nearly 50% of total emissions come from activities related to land use change, and forestry, compared to roughly 4% that come from industrial activities. So this poses a major, major thing, and where we have to put our efforts. No? It's a deterioration of nature and ecosystems is causing forests to shift from being carbon sinks to becoming carbon sources, along with the loss of habitats and ecosystem services. And so with the risks of severe events like floods, severe droughts, heat waves, and wildfires, we think that development strategies will need to include investments in resilient infrastructure as an essential mitigation measure. And this is where the need for resilient and sustainable materials becomes really important, and that's how cement and concrete play a factor. And just one more point to that is that you have to take into account that only second to water, concrete is the most used material in the world.
Yeah, thank you. So really the takeaways there are, this is an essential business and sector in order for economic growth to continue. The problem is it's energy intensive, and this is a problem which you've done a very good job of trying to solve. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. But the other piece of what Pedro is saying there is that the problem of industrialization and emissions is a very different problem than we might say, for example, in my home in Europe, where we're talking about emissions. In this part of the world, we're talking about deforestation. And that is a very different problem to solve, although you're trying to get to the same point. We're going to bring that together because you may wonder what deforestation has to do with cement and concrete, but he's going to explain that very shortly. Meanwhile, let's come to Vijay. Another business which is got some legacy problems in terms of emissions and so on. You have some difficult problems in ExxonMobil, but that's why it makes it so important, because you have to be, just like Pedro, more innovative than anybody else. So define the problem for ExxonMobil, if you would.
Yeah, let's do that. And first of all, thank you so much for asking me to participate in this. It's an honor to share the stage with you. And what a beautiful venue and a beautiful country. Thank you so much for spending some of your time to talk about this very, very important topic. And let's frame this in terms of problems, but also let's talk about this in terms of opportunities. Because energy is essential to prosperity. That's the first thing we have to all agree on, that everything in this room, everything in this room has energy flowing through it. Whether it's the carpeting, the lighting, the chairs, the wood, my very expensive suit, all came from energy. And we're not done in supplying energy yet, because there's 1 billion people out there that don't have access to energy. And several, up to 20, 30, 40% of the world living below what we consider minimum energy standards. So step one is we got to continue to supply energy. Now, the second part of that becomes equally important, which is while we're supplying that energy, we have to look for new solutions so that we can continue to provide energy while reducing emissions. That means doing what you can with the existing value chains, like producing oil, gas, renewables, everything while reducing emissions, but also looking at the new technologies that are going to be needed: carbon capture, hydrogen, biofuels, critical minerals. So we've got to do both. This is what we call the AND equation. We have to make sure that we continue to supply energy while reducing emissions at scales that, quite frankly, there's almost no analogy to talk about the scale of energy. It is such a massive, massive system. And to turn that over, to transform that, because that's what we're talking about here, is going to take a combination of policy, technology, infrastructure, different solutions by different geography. But we've got to get on with it. And we've got to start moving from these plans into actions. That's what companies like ours are trying to do, progressing projects, dedicating capital to that. But I think we got to just start with the basic. What is the problem we're trying to solve? And I would contend that the problem we're trying to solve is increasing energy and decreasing emissions.
Okay, and we're going to come back. So we've talked about energy here, and we've talked about our ability to build, so cement and concrete, two key elements in economic development, and arguably two of the most difficult ones to crack. Let's come to the question of Anna and finance, and tell us a bit about how you perceive the conflicts in this problem.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here representing the World Bank Group. So I love what I've just heard, which is really, in my view, about development. The world is still in great need of development. Many countries are still in great need of vast development in areas such as infrastructure. We still have many people around the world relying on income from agriculture. We still have many people who are living in countries where the emission release is not the problem, but it's adapting to climate change. So we at the World Bank Group are really having to, in many ways, rethink development in this world where we still have to see a significant amount of infrastructure development take place. We have to recognize that people work in areas like agriculture where water intensity can be high, where emissions from things like methane can be very prominent. And we have to recognize that there are many countries around the world that are having to deal with the impact of climate change more so than the release of emissions into the air. So what we've done to step back, and I'll come to financing, is really revisit our vision for development. And our new vision and mission of the World Bank is to end poverty on a livable planet. And I want to emphasize by livable planet, we of course mean a planet where the air is cleaner, the water is clean, but it also means where populations have access to basic services and basic infrastructure. So we have to find a way of making development and climate action, climate management coexist. And we do believe that there's a lot of solutions out there, but the first strong belief we have is that it takes everyone. It takes the public sector, which is of course part of the World Bank. It takes the private sector, which is great to listen to what I've heard here today. It takes civil society. It takes in partnerships with countries that are thinking through similar strategies. We know the financing needs are enormous, and we therefore know that the financing will have to come from different places. It will have to come from the public sector, and here the World Bank is a prominent provider of finance. We provided about $43 billion to climate-oriented operations last year, and we're on course to actually just announce that COP29, together with other multilateral development institutions, go to $120 billion. So that's our target to go towards with others, and that's important because partnerships matter. But we all know that the private sector has to really step up. This is where the real financing will come from. But I always like to say, let's not only focus on finance. Why? Because for me, what the private sector brings, and we just heard it, is actually innovation. A lot of the innovation in this space comes directly from the private sector. So while I'm very keen for us to partner with the private sector for finance, I'm very keen to see that transfer of technology to developing countries, to see the skills that are developed in the population and the workforce of developing countries thanks to the private sector engagement. And to do so, we have to think through how do we make sure that we provide the incentives, de-risking, guarantees to get the private sector to feel it's good to come into markets that may pose more risk. So for me, the financing, the needs are huge. It's going to take creativity to get there, public and private. But let's not just talk about finance. Let's talk about development, and let's talk about development in terms of what it is that we're looking for different parties who come to the table that they can bring, the comparative advantages.
So really, in short, if you have the ideas and the innovation, the finance will follow. It's not the start of the process, it's the second link.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's a good point then to come to Pedro and talk about some of your innovations. First of all, we mentioned cement and concrete. What we have not mentioned is energy. You also produce energy. That was one of the steps that you've taken, and I'd like to talk about the others in a moment. Let's talk about why you produce energy.
And that is one of the levers that we use for decarbonization, actually. I want to explain why cement manufacturing is so intensive in carbon emissions to begin with. To manufacture cement, you first have to heat the limestone and decompose it. And half of the carbon emissions that come in the cement manufacturing process come from the stone itself. No?
Because it's a carbonate,
because
so you are releasing.
it's a calcium carbonate.
Yeah.
So you use a very high temperature to decompose it in calcium oxide and CO2.
Yeah.
So half of the emissions come from the process of heating. Even if you didn't use any fossil fuels or any fuels at all, it would release CO2. And it's a major issue because there is no substitute at scale for cement and concrete. So this is the first setup. So what can we do about that? There are the traditional industrial levers on which we are working and implementing right now. And with these traditional industrial levers, we are on track to achieve a 20% reduction of our emissions by 2030, and I think about 50% of the reductions by 2050. So the remaining 50%, we need to talk about that later, but this first phase, the traditional levers, are mainly the use of additives to reduce the cement content in concrete, the use of supplementary cementitious materials like pozzolan or even calcine clay to reduce the content of clinker in cement, the use of alternative fuels to reduce the use of fossil fuels in the kilns, and investment in renewable energy and energy efficiencies. And that's where energy comes in. Our cement operations in Peru use practically 99% of hydropower energy to run. And in Ecuador and in the United States, operations in the United States, we are already using alternative fuels. In one of the kilns in Ecuador, we reached a substitution of 60% of fossil fuels in the kiln. So those are the traditional levers, and those will take us to a certain point. But the remaining challenge to reduce and go to carbon neutrality has to do with what do we do with the rest, the ones that we cannot avoid. And this is where carbon capture comes into place.
And tell me about carbon capture. There's a lot of debate about carbon capture and how effective it is. Tell me about your carbon capture.
Well, carbon capture means just to remove carbon from the gases, be it the flue gases that come from the stack or from the atmosphere in general. And in this case, we believe that the solutions have to be tailored to the reality of each region, actually. So to give you an example, in countries like Norway, where I was a few weeks ago, have a well-developed oil and gas infrastructure, they have economic resources, they have government support that could enable effective carbon capture through industrial processes. No? It's the use of amines, and they take out the gas from the stack, and then freeze it, make it liquid, and then inject it below the sea surface in the ocean. But we think that our best chance in Latin America, regions like Latin America, our best chance to make an impact is to offset emissions through nature-based solutions like the conservation of forests and the recovery of their capabilities to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. And we believe that in our region, that is the elephant in the room.
All right. So what you're saying is to your original point, is the solution and the problem depends on the region that you are in, and in this particular region, and Vijay's nodding there. So talk to me about some of the innovative solutions that you're finding of interest.
Yes, I'll build off of carbon capture.
Yeah.
And just real simple, CO2 is a byproduct. You make CO2, so whether it's calcium carbonate to CO2 or it's a combustion of a hydrocarbon, CO2 is a created molecule. And carbon capture and sequestration simply means when that CO2 is made, you abate it, you prevent it, you stop it, you block it from getting into the environment. You capture the CO2. Once you capture the CO2, you have two choices of what to do with the CO2. You can sequester it, bury it safely under the ground for long periods of time, or you can take that CO2 and try to utilize it into a different material. We know about this. Our company actually does more than CCS than anyone else. And as we look at CCS as a business chain, as a new value chain, a business in the future, we are already progressing contracts up to 7 million tons of CCS. We're also looking at how you start combining the blocks. So we didn't talk about hydrogen, which is a process fluid. Hydrogen is also a clean burning fuel. How do you
because it produces water.
It produces water as well.
Water, yeah.
Okay, right? You could use water, or it could, right? It depends on what your process is. But let's talk about the process we're progressing, which is to take a methane molecule, which is a carbon and 4 hydrogens. So 4 hydrogens, 1 carbon. And you go through a process by which you separate out the hydrogen, and you have CO2. So now you have hydrogen and you have CO2. Now, if you capture that CO2, you have low carbon intensity, low emissions intensity hydrogen, which is the target. The target is to produce the product with low CO2, low carbon intensity. That's the goal. Let's make sure we have the problem statement right. So we're progressing what would be the world's largest low carbon intensity hydrogen project, 1 million tons, which is about 10% of the US target for low emissions hydrogen, with one project. That scale, that's combining 2 value chains, a hydrogen value chain with a CCS value chain, to produce the necessary materials to provide the heat, to provide the energy, to provide the fuel for industrial processes. So that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to learn from what we've done over the past 130 years as we've built this amazing energy system that we have, and now rethink how we do it and think about the value chains, and then take our capabilities and invest in those capabilities to drive solutions at scale. And hydrogen, CCS, these are all really, really good examples of things that's actually happening. This isn't a planned pledge, this isn't a plan, this is action. These are projects that are in the capital investment cycle for us that we're planning to turn into projects.
Fascinating. Anna, then if I can come to you. These are companies who are coming up with solutions, and because they are commercial organizations, they're able to find innovative ways to raise the capital to do it too. It's not always as simple as that, isn't it? You have to make a case. I don't know if carbon capture is something that comes across your desk a great deal, but the scientific viability and commercial viability is something that's really important, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, again, coming back to this idea that the private sector innovates in areas that are very promising for development, which we then, as a development institution, can try to provide catalytic platforms around.
Yeah.
And just to give you one example that's very much on my mind right now, and maybe I want to make sure the room also heard it from me, which is something we call Mission 300.
Right.
Mission 300 is one of our flagship initiatives right now, which is to connect 300 million people in Africa to electricity by 2030. Why 300 million and why Africa? Because Africa is the only region, the only continent in the world where you have such a huge abundance of people still not having access. So the access fight, if you will, to electricity is mostly in Africa. About 50% of the population does not have access to basic electricity, and that's just over 600 million people, sub-Saharan Africa, and we want to halve that. That's why 300 million comes in. And how are we going to achieve that? It's very interesting. The analysis that we have seen and that we have done ourselves and we've seen others do suggests that 50% of that will have to actually come from off-grid solutions. Off-grid solutions tend to be provided by the private sector, and it tends to be through innovations in areas like solar. Yeah. So what we're now seeing is a lot of international, regional, and African private sector companies saying, we want to be part of the solution here. We have the market access, we have the knowledge about where the access is needed, but we need, perhaps it will be a subsidy on the capital cost to extend, or perhaps it will need some type of coordination with others to see how do we get this region to actually go to scale, because some of the off-grid solutions are in mini-grids, which are very small. So on their own, they don't add up to much, but together they add up to more. That's where the platform comes in. Often, bigger companies will say, we would love to invest in this country, but we see huge uncertainty on the policy regulatory side. Is the World Bank Group doing anything about this? And then we can use our programs in the country to actually try to work alongside with government to see what type of policies would help to provide that stability so the private sector feels, I know what the tariff regime will be, I know what the legal and regulatory regime will be, and I am very interested in putting a program of investments into this country. Finally,
can you give me an example in a moment? Give me an example of that, because I know you've got lots up your sleeve. Yeah, continue.
Yes, so all over the African continent, we're working now. We will have a big event at the end of January where 15 countries around Africa will come with very specific plans on what they need to do to get to their access rates. And we will then turn around and say, how do we, with partners, make this happen? Through finance, of course, through technology solutions, through de-risking instruments like guarantees, and through regulatory policy reforms that the country needs to do, and we're very happy to provide support to. So this will need a real initiative and organization underneath it, which is what we're doing together with the African Development Bank, Rockefeller Foundation, that's come in and provided a lot of really good technical assistance, as well as sustainable energy for all through the UN, which has a real access goal. So this is about partnerships, as it is about being super ambitious. And they go together because you won't reach ambitious targets if you don't work together with partners. And again, the private sector will be a huge part of the solution, and it's on us to find ways to make sure they're attracted and stay engaged.
Anna, thank you. Vijay, you've been nodding a lot there. When Anna was talking about this balance between regulation and policy and so on and the private sector, does that resonate with you?
Well, it does, but one word sums up what Anna was saying, and that's collaboration. We have got to think about how we combine together. Policy can help get technologies off, but policies have to lead to markets. This can't be policy forever. But if you get the right policy construct and you get technologies deployed, we know two things. We know, one, policy can enable technologies, and the second thing we know is technologies deployed, two things happen. Scale goes up, cost goes down. So if you look at what's actually working right now is some of the policies in the US, the IRA, which is inspiring some of the projects that you see talking about. Why? Because they're technology neutral. They allow you some certainty in terms of the support, and it allows you to get to the scales. So as we're talking and we think about the financing and the policy, right? Those dimensions have to be thinking about how does a market ultimately form. And when you're talking to companies like ours and we're thinking about technology, we have to be thinking about how are these technologies going to scale. And this is the equilibrium between policy and technology. Now there's a bridge between policy and technology which is really, really important, particularly in the developing nations, and that's infrastructure. So if you're in a developed nation, your infrastructure is already built. So you're going to do what you can to use your existing infrastructure. You talked about electricity. Well, if there's already a grid, you're thinking about how to plug into an existing grid. Okay, well, let's say you don't have a grid yet. You're a developing nation. You talked about off-grid power. Now you're going to rethink how you do this. And there's a huge opportunity to do that. Now, the basics of how you produce power, the physics is not changing. We can try as hard as we want, but we're not changing thermodynamics, we're not changing physics. We are going to change the application. And that's going to be a very geographical specific thing. It's going to be policy, market forming, technology. And the more we can have these discussions, which is why I was nodding, the more we can have these discussions around what is the solution set, what is the problem we're trying to go at, and you have those two arrays, and now you're bringing the arrays together, now we're all working in the same direction. More energy, lower emissions. That's what has to happen. It's a technology gap at the end of the day. It's not just me saying it. The IEA tracks energy technologies and says of over 50 technologies that are needed, only 3 are on track. So we've got to just be humble a little bit here and say the scientists have to get to work. And we've got to come up with new technologies. And as we come up with the new technologies, we can't keep Anna and team in the dark. We have to tell you what's coming. So you're anticipating. And now we're collaborating towards the future. We're not collaborating towards the past. And I think that's what it's going to take to do that. Real action, real collaboration to get these technologies so that we can get to where we all want to get to. Everybody has access to energy, and we have a clean environment. That's the goal, and we've got to keep working towards that.
Pedro, it sounds like you collaborate a lot with developing technologies outside your company. You're not working in a vacuum at UNACEM.
Once again, let me make the case for nature-based solutions. And that is something that we're pushing very hard in Latin America for the cement and concrete industry. Just to give you, we talk about scale. In the recent COP16, it was shared that nature-based solutions could contribute with 1/3 of the required emission reductions by 2030. And we have also to take into account the long-term positive externalities that those activities entail for future generations. We at Grupo UNACEM, that is why we at Grupo UNACEM have been investing, researching, and learning about conservation on a pilot scale. We established the first endowment fund for the economic sustainability of a natural protected area in the Peruvian Andes, and the first private conservation area in the Lima region to protect fragile ecosystems. But we also believe that the true potential for large-scale nature-based solutions lies in tropical forests, and specifically in the Amazon rainforest. As I mentioned, it's a matter of how do we restore its capability, how do we stop it from degrading, and how do we restore its capability to work as a carbon sink. And I will go to take the thing about regulation that I think it's important, and what the role of the private sector with regards to regulation should be, at least. Two things. I want to start reiterating that we believe that nature can be our best ally in the fight against climate change, but we also believe in the power of collaboration and consensus building within the industry to engage with policymakers and regulators in a unified and coherent way. And it is only that way that we can get regulatory frameworks that first recognize where the problem is. As you mentioned, if you don't frame the problem right, there's no right solution. And in this particular case, we think that the climate crisis will not be able to be solved if we don't address the nature issue. And also regulation needs to enable and recognize the necessity that to enable market creations and financial mechanisms to draw investment into the most cost-effective and impactful solutions.
Yes, and this is another point, and it's very interesting in the context of your company and, of course, Vijay's, is in the end, you are a commercial enterprise. Whatever solutions you find, the numbers have to add up, don't they? So how do you make that balance? At what point do you say this is going to work at scale and this is not? Have you gone down blind alleys?
As I mentioned, at this point, traditional levers can work at scale, the ones that can bring us to a reduction of 50% of our emissions by 2050.
Right.
Those we know that work. When it comes to the next step, if the industry is to become carbon neutral, That's where we have to find solutions that work at scale, and that's where policy plays a fundamental role. And I don't think that policymakers by themselves will come up with a solution. The solutions will have to come working with the industry.
Vijay, this presents in a way a communication challenge as much as anything else, doesn't it? Because people, to communicate something which is fragmented and the solutions are different according to where you are, and the solutions aren't necessarily the entire solution, they're part of it, and so on. This is all a very complicated thing, or is it, to communicate?
Well, I think it's very hard to communicate. I think that's why these venues and these discussions are so important, that we can actually talk about all that everybody's trying to do to solve this problem. This is a challenge unlike any others. The scale, not just in terms of size. We've been throwing around some really, really big numbers that most people don't understand, but it's also geographic scale. You can't leave anybody behind here. I mean, we talked about Africa, where they're just trying to get power. They're not thinking about decarbonization. They want power. They just want lights. They want a light bulb. They want clean water. They want clean cooking fuel. This really shouldn't be that hard a thing to align on, that we've got to close that gap. Now, how do we apply the technologies? How do we get onto the types of solutions we want to do? I mean, that's where companies like ours make a difference, because we're trying to deploy the technologies at scale. Now, it's not going to be everything we're doing it's just a portion of it. But each little portion matters. And the more we get solutions at scale, the more those scale solutions can then transfer from developed nations to the developing nations. You hear this phrase leapfrog a lot. What does leapfrog mean?
Yeah.
Leapfrog means taking what's already been proven and starting there. So it's taken us 130 years to get to where we are. Okay, we don't want to wait 130 years for Africa to get there, right? They can learn. And this is what we've seen in telecommunications. This is what we've seen in a lot of other sectors. There is a way to apply learnings from others. Again, a different form of collaboration. A different form of collaboration. This is so much about how do we collaborate, how do we change the way we talk about it, how do we share best practices. In our industry, we have a thing called the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, which is really trying to take things that we've learned about how we reduce methane, which is a very potent global warmer. How do we take that methane and that technology to reduce methane and transfer it immediately to the developing nations? So that's a tangible example of how you take what's known and move it over. And I think the more we get these technologies deployed, I think the more opportunities. Now let's bring back the financing, let's bring back the policy, because everything has to work together. And the more we can get what we call integrated roadmaps, the more we can bring all these pieces together and understand how it fits, I think the faster we're going to get to where we want to go.
Anna, we are, despite our ambitions and our achievements, faced with failure, floods, wildfires, and so on, evidence that climate change is happening. We have not substantially turned the tide, and we don't seem on course to do so. But despite that, it seems that the private sector is very engaged now in this mission. Are you encouraged by what you see in the private sector, that it is no longer governments and, for example, COP conferences that are trying to drive change, that really a lot more momentum is now genuinely coming from the private sector and from investment?
Yes, you know, you can sort of say, is it coming through, you know, push or pull?
Yes.
I do think we have seen some innovations, let's say financial taxonomy, policies, regulations that are making the private sector, making companies think twice about business as usual because it might cost them. And since, as you said, at the end of the day, it's about bottom line, it's about shareholder value, you have to adjust to the regulatory regime you're operating within. So take, you know, the carbon adjustment border mechanism, for example, in Europe. Take financial taxonomies that various central banks and financial sector institutions are looking at. But I also really like this, and that's a bit of a push, right? That's being pushed on you. But I really like this, what I just heard about nature-based solutions. You know, the innovations that companies bring themselves, knowing that we are going to continue to be relying on energy. Energy is carbon emission heavy, we know that from science. but we also know that we're operating in a new environment and we have to innovate. So I feel like there's a lot of ideas coming from the private sector that we at the World Bank need to make sure that we can help harness so that it can be scaled to countries that need to leapfrog and learn from new technologies, new ideas, but also replicated, because once it gets replicated, it does two things. It starts getting cheaper, which is good for developing countries, and it starts getting faster, which is good for developing countries because they need solutions faster. I will also just make one more point, which is the analytics can help. So we have a product called the Country Climate and Development Report, and it sets out to show that you don't have to choose between climate and development. The two actually go hand in hand. And just to give you an example here, we have completed one in Peru. And the one we completed in Peru shows that the GDP of Peru could be 2% higher by 2030 thanks to climate action as part of the economic development growth model. It could be 10% higher by 2050. Why is this? Because it creates new jobs, it thinks through new processes of getting production done, and it actually creates avenues for attracting new investment by companies and corporations that are looking for more sustainable markets. And sometimes finance is actually attached to those investment opportunities, so you can also tap into more sustainable finance options. So I think analytics can help. The communication of those analytics is key to make it simple and clear. And that's really what we also need to be in that space of working with.
And at some point this afternoon and tomorrow, we're going to talk about the political environment and how conducive it is. But I feel this is not the moment. I feel the moment is to end on a positive note. I'd like to thank Anna, Pedro, and Vijay for their participation, and you for listening. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.